Some women walk into a room and everything changes, not because they demand attention, but because they carry something most people aren't prepared to face: clarity, self-possession, intelligence. And for emotionally weak men, that presence doesn't inspire admiration. It triggers a quiet war inside them. Why does a woman's strength, her ability to think, to question, to stand alone, feel like a threat to some men? What is it about an intelligent, emotionally grounded woman that exposes the deepest insecurities in those who haven't done the inner work? It's not her intellect that scares them. It's what her intellect represents: truth, independence, accountability. And in a world where many men are still taught to measure their worth by dominance and control, a woman who doesn't need them, emotionally, intellectually, or financially, can feel like an earthquake. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And that's the heart of it. A self-aware woman forces reflection without saying a word. She becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. So when a man lacks emotional grounding, when his identity is built on external validation or shallow power, he doesn't see her strength as a gift. He sees it as an attack, not because she's cruel, but because her existence challenges the story he tells himself about being enough. This isn't about superiority, it's about emotional weight and what happens when one person has done the work and the other hasn't even started. When one speaks from self-knowledge and the other still hides behind performance, pretending not to be afraid of their own reflection. This is why so many intelligent women are mislabeled as cold, difficult, or intimidating, not because they are, but because they make it harder for emotionally weak men to hide from themselves. Let's break this open, not just to understand the dynamic, but to understand ourselves. But first, we need to get clear on something. What exactly do we mean when we say intelligent woman or emotionally weak man? These aren't just stereotypes or insults thrown around in heated arguments. They're psychological profiles, patterns of thinking, behavior, and emotional processing that shape how people show up in relationships, conversations, and power dynamics. An intelligent woman isn't just someone with degrees or sharp wit. Her intelligence goes beyond facts and figures. She's emotionally literate. She can name what she feels. She asks questions that matter. She sees patterns where others see noise, and more than anything, she doesn't pretend to be smaller than she is to make others comfortable. That's the kind of intelligence we're talking about, integrated intelligence, where head and heart are both awake. Now, on the other side, let's talk about what makes a man emotionally weak. It's not about crying or being sensitive. Let's throw that outdated idea out. In fact, the inability to express vulnerability is part of emotional weakness. A man is emotionally weak when he's disconnected from his inner world, when his worth depends on control, validation, or the silence of others. He resists being challenged, avoids introspection, and reacts defensively to truth, especially when it comes from a woman who refuses to play small. Think of it like this: if confidence is a flame, emotionally weak men only feel warm when they're the ones holding the lighter. But when a woman shows up already lit, they panic. Not because she's doing anything wrong, but because her light makes them aware of their own emotional darkness. And here's where things get dangerous. Instead of sitting with that discomfort, instead of asking, "Why do I feel this way?" they project, they deflect, they label her too much, too intense, too opinionated. These are not assessments of her character, they're confessions of his insecurity. So, if this is the framework, here's the next question. What is actually happening inside the mind of an emotionally weak man when he meets a woman he cannot control, silence, or impress? The answer lies in a psychological collision, one that Carl Jung would describe as a confrontation with the shadow. This is the part of the psyche where we store everything we refuse to face about ourselves. Our insecurities, our fears, our inadequacies. When a man hasn't acknowledged his shadow, he projects it outward, and often the woman standing in front of him becomes the screen. Let's make this real. Imagine a man who was raised to believe his value comes from being needed financially, emotionally, or intellectually. Now imagine he meets a woman who doesn't need any of those things from him, but still chooses to show up fully in the conversation. She challenges him, not disrespectfully, but confidently. She isn't trying to impress him, she's simply being herself. In that moment, he's no longer dealing with her, he's dealing with himself. His pride starts to crumble because her presence exposes something he's been avoiding, his own emotional emptiness. Her independence reminds him how dependent he is on being validated. Her clarity highlights his confusion. Her calm forces him to confront his internal chaos. And if he hasn't done the work, hasn't faced his past, questioned his ego, or healed his wounds, he doesn't feel inspired, he feels exposed. So what does he do? He deflects. He accuses her of being cold. He says she's too ambitious or too intense. But beneath those labels is fear. Not fear of her, but fear of himself around her. Because if she doesn't need fixing and she doesn't need saving, then who is he without that role? This is why Jung warned that the things that most upset us in others are often the unhealed parts of ourselves. And that's the exact mechanism at work here. But it gets deeper. Sometimes this dynamic doesn't just trigger fear, it triggers shame. And shame, when left unchecked, can become resentment. So here's what we need to ask next. When that resentment starts to build, how does it show up? What does it look like in real life, at work, in relationships, in casual conversations? This is the part where things get subtle and dangerous, because emotional weakness rarely storms in loudly. It creeps in through passive jabs, shifting tones, and undermining behavior disguised as concern. Let's talk about how this dynamic unfolds in the everyday world. Picture this. A woman shares an innovative idea in a meeting, thought out, data-backed, sharp. She's not showing off, she's contributing. But instead of acknowledgement, she gets a thin smile and a deflective comment like, "Well, that's ambitious. Maybe we should start with something simpler." That's not critique, it's containment. And it often comes from someone who feels displaced by her competence. Or think about a relationship. A woman expresses her boundaries calmly, what she expects, what she won't tolerate. She's not angry, she's clear, but her partner shuts down emotionally, labels her as dramatic, then withdraws affection as a form of punishment. That isn't love, it's emotional manipulation rooted in fragility. Sometimes it's even more covert. She starts noticing how often he interrupts her, how her achievements are minimized, how the conversation subtly shifts to highlight his stress, his ideas, his needs. Slowly, her brilliance becomes something he tries to mute, not because he hates her, but because he doesn't feel enough next to her. This is where Carl Jung's insight becomes deeply relevant. He said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But when that irritation is met with defensiveness instead of curiosity, it turns into resentment. And resentment has one goal: to shrink the person who made you feel small, rather than asking why you felt small to begin with." Here's the hard truth. Many emotionally weak men don't even realize they're doing this. It's not always conscious. They're not plotting to silence women. They're reacting to a perceived threat. But when someone refuses to examine that reaction, they end up harming the very person they claim to love, respect, or admire. So what happens when a woman refuses to shrink? What happens when she doesn't apologize for her presence? That's where the dynamic begins to flip and where the real power shift takes place. This is the moment the dynamic begins to shift, and it's often the turning point in the story. Because when a woman stands firm in her identity, despite the discomfort it causes others, she's no longer playing a role. She's embodying her truth, and that can either invite growth or ignite resistance. Let's be clear, not shrinking isn't about being loud or confrontational. It's not about trying to prove anything. It's about not editing yourself for someone else's comfort. It's choosing not to dim your ideas, your curiosity, or your vision just because someone else hasn't yet found theirs. In a healthy environment, that strength is respected, even admired. But in a fragile one, it's punished. Some men might pull away. Others may attempt to regain control through emotional withdrawal or subtle sabotage. And some, sadly, will try to convince her that she needs to tone it down just to keep the peace. But here's the truth. Peace that requires your silence isn't peace. It's quiet control. This is why so many intelligent women feel isolated, not because they're unlovable, but because they're unwilling to perform palatability. They've outgrown the need to be liked for the wrong reasons, and that shift changes everything. It forces emotionally weak men to either evolve or exit. Carl Jung believed the goal of life was individuation, to become whole. But wholeness doesn't come from being accepted by everyone. It comes from accepting yourself, even when it costs you the illusion of harmony. So here's the deeper question. If a woman chooses not to shrink, but the man she's with chooses not to grow, what happens next? That's the line where relationships begin to fracture or transform. This is the breaking point. Not always dramatic, often quiet, but it's a moment of reckoning that many relationships never recover from. What we're addressing here is the emotional fork in the road. On one path, the man recognizes his discomfort, examines it, and begins the slow, humbling work of self-reflection. On the other path, he doubles down, retreating further into ego, defensiveness, or even subtle hostility. One path leads to connection, the other to disconnection, masquerading as distance. In real terms, this is where you start hearing things like, "You've changed," "You're always trying to prove something," or the classic, "You make everything about you." But if you listen closely, those words don't reflect her behavior, they reflect his emotional ceiling. The problem isn't that she changed, it's that he stayed the same while she evolved, and rather than rise with her, he chooses to reject what he doesn't understand. At this point, many women start to question themselves. Am I too much? Am I being unfair? Should I just let it go to save the relationship? But here's the hard truth. No relationship survives long-term when one person is committed to growth and the other is committed to comfort. Eventually, the gap becomes unbearable. Carl Jung taught that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off what's uncomfortable, but by integrating it. If a man isn't willing to look inward, if he avoids his emotional gaps, then her strength will always feel like pressure. Her questions will always sound like attacks, and her presence will always seem like a challenge instead of a gift. So what do emotionally mature men do differently in these situations? They don't shrink from a strong woman's presence. They step toward it, not to overpower or compete, but to understand, to grow alongside her. For these men, intelligence isn't intimidating, it's magnetic. It invites conversation, reflection, and evolution. The difference lies in how they interpret discomfort. Where the emotionally fragile man feels exposed and lashes out, the emotionally mature man feels challenged and leans in. He sees her clarity not as a threat to his masculinity, but as a mirror to his potential. Her strength doesn't emasculate him, it inspires him to step further into his own. And let's be honest, it's not that mature men never feel insecure. Everyone does. The key is they've learned to own those feelings. They ask themselves, why is this bothering me? What does this reveal about me? What do I still need to work on? They've done the inner work that Jung so often emphasized. They've begun integrating the shadow, the parts of themselves that were once buried under pride or silence. And because of that, they don't need a partner who plays small to feel strong. They want a partner who expands with them. Think about how different this looks in real life. A woman shares her ambition, her plans, her vision, and instead of responding with silence or criticism, he says, "Tell me more." Not as a performance, but as a sign of respect. He listens, he supports, and he doesn't feel smaller just because she's standing tall. This kind of man isn't rare because men are incapable of this growth. He's rare because too few are taught that emotional strength is built through vulnerability, not control. So if that's what maturity looks like, here's the question that matters most. What does Carl Jung's deeper philosophy say about this kind of integration, and how does it guide both men and women toward wholeness rather than power struggles? Jung believed that the ultimate purpose of human life wasn't to become good in the eyes of others, but to become whole in the eyes of the self. He called this process individuation, the conscious integration of all parts of who you are, including those you've been taught to suppress, reject, or hide. Now, apply that to this dynamic. An emotionally grounded, intelligent woman isn't just strong. She's integrated. She knows her thoughts. She honors her emotions. She questions her patterns. She owns her flaws. She has taken her shadow by the hand instead of locking it in the basement. That's why her presence feels intense. She's not wearing a mask. And Jung taught that when someone has dropped their mask, the persona, it confronts others who are still hiding behind theirs. The reaction, often defense, projection, or withdrawal. But here's the deeper insight. Both men and women carry inner masculine and feminine energies. Jung called them the animus and the anima. The emotionally mature man doesn't run from a woman's strength because he's reconciled with the strength inside himself, his own animus. And the mature woman, she's no longer threatened by softness or surrender because she's made peace with her own anima, her emotional depth, her intuition, her quiet power. When these two meet, it's no longer a competition of roles. It's a conversation between two complete individuals. No one needs to dominate. No one needs to submit. They meet, as Jung described, in the alchemical union of opposites. This is the transformation the emotionally weak man resists, not because it's impossible, but because it requires surrender, not to the woman, but to himself. And that leads us to the final reflection. What does this all mean for the intelligent woman who's been labeled, silenced, or misunderstood for simply standing in her truth? It means you were never too much. You were only too awake for someone who hadn't yet opened their eyes. If you've ever been told you're intimidating, it's important to understand intimidation is a reflection of their emotional unreadiness, not your value. And that label, it's often an attempt to disarm what can't be controlled. A woman who sees herself clearly and refuses to apologize for it. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And for women like you, that journey is sacred, but rarely easy. You will unsettle people. You will be misunderstood. You may even walk alone for seasons, but don't confuse solitude with failure. Sometimes the silence around you simply means you've risen above the noise. So here's what you do. You keep going. You keep questioning. You keep honoring your instincts, your intelligence, your voice. You don't shrink to fit the mold. You don't contort yourself to make fragile egos feel safe. You keep the light on, not just for yourself, but for the people still stumbling through their own darkness. And to the emotionally weak men who might be listening, this isn't an attack, it's an invitation. Because the moment you stop blaming confident women for your discomfort is the moment you can finally begin the journey back to yourself. Growth isn't easy, neither is integration, but Jung reminds us that wholeness isn't perfection, it's truth. And truth, once seen, can never be unseen. So wherever you are in this dynamic, whether you're the woman who won't shrink or the man learning how to stand beside her, remember this. Power doesn't lie in control, it lies in self-awareness. And the relationship you're ready for is the one that meets you where you are, but refuses to let you stay there. If this resonated with you, I want to hear from you. What part of this truth challenged you the most, or confirmed what you've known all along? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found value in this, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay whole, stay awake,